Hi, my name is Jake Soberall. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of Bitwise Industries, a technology company headquartered in Fresno, California. In a non-pandemic setting, we are a company that is dedicated to issues of equity and workforce in and for the technology industry. Here, amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, we thought it important to convene conversations around how communities throughout the country are responding to this moment. What are they trying? What's working and what's not? But as we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are living through incredible times. The murder of George Floyd and subsequent mass demonstrations have impacted all of us. These issues matter here in Fresno and around the country. They need to be addressed here and everywhere. The extraordinary events of the last 2 weeks have compelled us to pivot. We are bringing to you as our premiere episode what was originally recorded as our second episode. While this is not explicitly a discussion of policing in America, it is a discussion of systemic inequalities that need to be resolved for us to move forward. I think you will hear from the guests on today's show that while none reference George Floyd by name because of the timing of this episode, all have dedicated their substantial careers to resolving systemic racism in our country. We are committed as a show, and I am committed as a CEO, to being part of the solutions. The many solutions that we need for our country to move forward and fulfill its promise of protecting its people, all of them. Thank you for joining us. Let's get started. All right, I am really excited to welcome to the show this morning Richelieu Dennis. Rich, I know that you'll remember this, but a story that resonates deeply for Irma and I and Bitwise is not long ago when we had set out to raise our Series A, which is a round of financing for Bitwise Industries. Two kids from the middle of nowhere were sort of trying to figure out this fundraising thing. And we sent a cold email to somebody who we found online with an amazing life story, but to whom we had absolutely no connection. And of course, that was you. And to our great fortune, you answered. What we've learned since is that you have built a platform for empowering people like us and things like Bitwise. And that's not common. I'd love to have us get started with you sharing how and why you did that.
Yeah, well, the funny thing now is you look back on it and know how bad I am with email. It goes to show you how divine of an intervention that was. Because
That's right.
my email game is horrible. But look, I had built a business and with my family for the past 30 years, we've been building this business, and it was based on some very fundamental principles around community and investing in community. And more specifically, we modeled it and call it community commerce. And the whole idea there is that we should be investing back in the communities where we do our commerce, where we get our dollars. We should be investing those dollars back in those communities, because far too often what we see, especially in the African American community, are businesses that benefit economically from our community, whether it's services to us, whether it's products to us, whether it's creating brands and products based on Black culture, a whole host of ways. But the people that those cultural creations come from very rarely get the economic benefit of it, right? The people that are patronizing the convenience stores or the supermarkets are not the owners of those stores. And so we built a model that said we're gonna invest back in these communities, and that's our community commerce model. And so I also had the good fortune or the bad fortune of building a business in an environment that is not very friendly to people that look like me. And we're seeing that play out today, right now. What happens with small Black and brown businesses and their access to capital and all of those things. So having gone through all of those experiences and having had the tutelage of my mother and the conviction of what we need to do in our communities, we've always sort of done that, right? Community commerce has always been a part of what we've done. And over the years, we built a platform that actually figured out how to do this in a sustainable way, how to do it in an intentional way, and how to do it in a way that actually yields returns, so that we can create a flywheel, so that we're generating returns that get reinvested back in the community. So it's a long-winded answer, but it took 30 years to get here, and we're here. I'm glad I saw that email.
And us too. And I think that answer is a wonderful segue into an introduction of Freada Kapor Klein, who is joining us also this morning. Now, Freada, Rich told a story that unfolded over the course of 30 years. And in the rearview mirror sitting here, it sure feels like you spent about that period of time sort of fighting a clearing for companies like Bitwise to exist, and have been deeply steeped in that work over that long haul. I wonder if, as you were in that work, did you see this coming? And by this, I mean the opportunity to build a portfolio like you all have at the Kapor Center with those extraordinary companies, a world in which things like Bitwise and Promise and Genius Plaza are a bit more possible.
Well, I was not exactly that good of a fortune teller, but all the decades I spent starting as an activist, working on issues of bias and harassment and discrimination, focusing very much on what does it mean to create fair and welcoming work cultures. All of that was a prelude to saying it's too hard to turn around big entrenched companies. It's much better to bake diversity and inclusion into startups from the beginning. And so as long as Kapor Capital has been 100% impact focus, which is going on 10 years now, we have looked at businesses, tech businesses that close gaps of access or opportunity or outcome for low-income communities and or communities of color. And so that disproportionately means that we have entrepreneurs of color because they're using their lived experience to identify a need, to identify, as Rich talked about, a way of doing business, not just the product or services, that is vital and that is a new model.
And I think that idea of building these businesses from the ground up is so important. And if you've been in this work at all, you realize the necessity of it. One thing that weighs heavily for us here at Bitwise, and I know for each of you, is in this moment, there are so many hard-fought gains that we are concerned about. And in particular, when we think about Freada, women and people of color in entrepreneurship amidst a pandemic. What are the things that we can be doing to ensure that this moment does not wind up a step backwards for communities that have had hard-fought battles to get here?
Well, I think there is a silver lining, and I tend to be an optimist. Who else would be doing this work for so many decades? But I do see as a silver lining the way in which this pandemic has exposed the structural racism, the inequities that have existed for a very long time. And what we now see are people recognizing the underlying inequities that led us to these different outcomes, these wildly, devastatingly different outcomes of the pandemic. So that means we have an opportunity to fix it. But it also means that there are more threats as financial markets shut down, as resources dry up. Those who are historically have been hit hardest and hit first are already marginalized, low-income people of color. And we have to fight very deliberately and very hard to make sure that doesn't happen this time.
It's so important, and I think that one of those institutions, Rich, of course, is the national press, and also a key piece of your work is what you all do at Essence Magazine, which is, of course, a deeply important voice, particularly for women and particularly for women of color. And from that vantage point, I'm curious whether you think that the national press is doing enough to cover the disproportionate impact of this pandemic on communities of color in this really, really trying time.
Yeah, I think that, so the answer to your question is no, right? The short answer, because I think what we hear in the national press is sort of the end result, right? This many companies didn't get PPP. This many companies got PPP. This many, right? What we don't, and you have to realize that people are being exposed to this for the first time, right? But they're being exposed to it through the lenses of COVID. And so the understanding is that COVID is causing these issues, right? And so what will end up happening is, but the reality is COVID did not cause these issues. These issues did not start with COVID. These issues are centuries old, right? And they will not go away with PPP funding, and they won't go away post-COVID, right? There are real structural issues that we have to be addressing, and unfortunately, the press is not talking about those structural issues. They're not exposing to the general public why these structural issues exist, and they're not. And there's no, except for forums like these, the national press is not creating a dialogue that talks about these issues beyond COVID, right? That is now focused on what are the structural changes that have to happen. It's not holding our government accountable. It's not holding our policies accountable. It's not holding our institutions accountable. It's not holding our partners at large accountable, right? And so I think, so the answer to your question is no. What I do think is that the national press coverage has created an opening for people to now understand, to be aware to some extent, and it's going to be up to brands like Essence and the national press, really, which includes Essence, to start to deliver a more thoughtful and a more solutions-oriented conversation.
Yeah, and all of that feels right, which is part of the motivation behind convening these conversations, because we are both seeing the negative impacts and also some really extraordinary positive responses that are uniquely tailored to communities of poverty, communities of color, small towns. Rich, what is Essence's response to this? How have you changed coverage? Where are you going deeper than you were before?
Yeah. So the interesting thing about this is that, this is we've been talking about these issues for 50 years, right? So these are issues that are very well known and established in the Black community, established in the audiences that we speak to on a day in, day out basis. Where we're going deeper now is around the solutions, right? So speaking of national press coverage, there's an article, I believe it was in the New York Times a few days ago, that is talking about how New Orleans and the impact that COVID has had on New Orleans is worse on the Black community today than Katrina was. And you can imagine what that actually means, right? And if you can imagine that it didn't have to be that. When you think about all of the funding that went into New Orleans that was supposed to be helping that community, around Katrina to be sitting here all these years later, and we're worse off today. And we're, as a society, are having the same reaction that we had to Katrina. Let's go in and solve it with money, right? But where that money goes, who that money goes to, are they building infrastructure to support these people? Are we supporting the organizations that are on the ground day in, day out, working with these communities so that they can build infrastructure, so that they can build scale, so that we're not constantly repeating this every time something happens? So that's where we're going deeper, right? And it's not just in New Orleans; it's all across the country. Let's put programs together that actually will sustain these communities. Let's invest in the people that live in these communities, not the large multinational aid organizations or support organizations that will come in, do the work, and then leave. When they come in, they bring their capacity, they bring their expertise, and when they leave, they take their capacity and they take their expertise. And most times, the infrastructures that are set up are temporal. So people aren't really getting the services that they need on an ongoing basis, or the assists that they need on an ongoing basis. So where we're focused now is we're going to go out and raise capital that we are going to invest back into the institutions that have historically been in those communities, do capacity building, do infrastructure building, and not leave a year from now when this is all over, but remain there and remain in these communities and continue to build. And as you know, Jake, we do this. For us, our flywheel, like Freada, our flywheel is business, right? It's entrepreneurship. It's investing in entrepreneurship in these communities where people can start to have make their own economic decisions, where they can invest in their own institutions and their own structures of local government and their own sort of community way of existing to build those up. So that's where we're focused.
Yeah, and with that, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. All right. We are delighted to be joined this morning by Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who's joining us from Washington, D.C., but represents the East Bay here in California. And Congresswoman Lee, one of the things that occurs to me this morning is that you, as a member of Congress, are doing the work that you do, but have to be acutely aware that you're doing it at the center of an historic moment. I'd love to just hear, as a human being, what that feels like.
Well, yeah, you're right. This is an historic moment, but it's also a very dangerous moment, both from a health point of view and from an economic point of view. And so we're elected to lead even in times of crises, even in times of pandemics. And so we have to do both. We have to just kind of make sure we're adhering to all of the health requirements and make sure that we're fighting for our constituents, for the country, for the planet, so that we can not only get through this, but so that we can get on the other side of it. And I won't even say go back to normal, but what I'm thinking about now is making sure people survive, but then we come out of this in a way where there are many populations of people who don't need to nor do want to go back to normal because life has been so hard for them for so many years.
I think that's right. And one of the things that I've been looking forward to talking with you about specifically is that you bring to this conversation a unique perspective in that you've been in Congress now for 9/11, for the Great Recession, and for this moment. And that same refrain that you just echoed has been your work that entire time. I'm curious how those moments and this moment feel the same and or different.
Well, during 9/11, since I was the only one to vote against that horrible blank check that has led to the use of force in over 41 countries, I was the only one. And so it was a much more isolating feeling. And the attacks were so horrific, and the anger and the hate mail and the death threats, until I had to prepare myself to deal with all of that in a different way. Now we're in this together. And so what I learned, and the hopefully wisdom and the wherewithal that I learned through 9/11 and how to survive, literally, those skills and that understanding now, I hope is helping other people through my work to figure out how to survive through this very terrible moment and not get depressed or overwhelmed or cynical. And we can't allow that to happen. So you have to deal with the reality, which I had to during 9/11, of what was taking place, but also know that you have to keep hope alive, and you have to keep encouraging people to do what's necessary to get through this so that we can get on the other side of it together. So it's more of a we and together moment now, where it was like defending myself by myself before.
Yeah, and I think that thread of hope is so very important. And Freada, you won't recall this, but it's a deeply important moment to us. Some number of years ago, Irma, who is the co-founder of Bitwise, and I heard you speak at an event hosted by Comcast. And in that event, it felt as though this wonderful human being she's talking about us. And I think since that moment, we've been not only enthralled with your work, but privileged to work alongside you, but we've looked to your leadership. And so I'm curious, whose leadership are you looking to in this moment and moving forward?
Well, I think, as the Congresswoman said, it takes all of us. And as Rich said earlier, we want to be looking to those who are the trusted members of communities, of formerly marginalized communities, communities of color, low-income communities. Who are those trusted leaders that we need to lift up to find the solutions? I also, Jake, have to say, I look to people like you and Irma as entrepreneurs in the Kapor Capital portfolio. I look to our SMASH Scholars, which is our nonprofit, the program that is in its 18th year for underrepresented high school students of color, exposing them to STEM. We're on 10 campuses in the U.S. I look to those young people as the generation of leaders to be, those who will follow in Congresswoman Lee's footsteps.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important note. I've watched Kapor Capital, Kapor Center, Mitch and you as individuals meet this moment and really lean in, not to new things. We already knew what the work was, but to the same communities that you've been serving all along in impactful ways. And Rich, I've seen the same from you, and particularly the way that you've used the Essence platform. You talk a little bit about what this moment has inspired for you and your team?
Yeah, I think what this moment has inspired, and that's actually that's a wonderful question, and I hope that question will get asked more. And the reason that I say that is because there are people that have been doing this work, like the folks that you have on this panel and in this conversation, for a very long time. When it wasn't sexy, when it wasn't pretty, when it wasn't the thing to do. Right. And I think what it's done is this moment has made it sexy. It's made it pretty. And it's made it so that other people want to come into it, that other people want to come and do this work. I think those of us that have been doing it need to embrace that, but to also hold accountable those that are coming in to say, hey, this is not a temporal thing. This is not because it's in the moment. This is a long-term commitment, and we're going to partner alongside you, but hold you accountable to this long-term, to these long-term goals and these long-term objectives. And I think through that, I think we will start to, because I think one of the things that I'm sure, is always on Freada's mind and on the Congresswoman's mind, and certainly on my mind, is we can't get to where we want to by ourselves. It's going to take a village, a huge village, right? Because the hole that we're digging out of is so deep and has been ignored for so long that it's going to take every single organization, group, person, idea to pull us out of it. And so for me, that's what it's inspiring in me, is finding the people that now want to come in and figuring out how to partner with them, but to do it in a way that it becomes sustainable. Because as I said earlier, what we're not trying to do is to create another New Orleans situation post-Katrina.
Yeah, and I think with that, Congresswoman Lee, this will be no news to you, but you're sitting in a place that's not exactly known for its collaboration. But nonetheless, Congress has, in response to COVID, moved quickly on a couple of things and gotten aid out to the American people. I think we know a bit about that. I wonder if there might be a story of collaboration across the aisle or with folks that you don't ordinarily work amidst all of this that you could share.
Sure. There have been many stories. In fact, these stories don't meet the press. They're not covered necessarily. And I think that during this moment, we can just look at the most recent bill in terms of the HEROES Act and what happened and how that was put together, and with no collaboration, tried to, but again, I hate to be partisan, but the Republicans just would not come to the table. So that's one example of how we had to do the work together. And our Democratic caucus is very diverse in terms of ideology, geographically, racially, based on our different ethnic backgrounds. So we came together to put forward a bill that would continue to help the American people recover from this pandemic. We hopefully, now that it's in the Senate, we'll see some part of bipartisanship. But when Mitch McConnell put forth a bill a couple of weeks ago, the CARES bill, he wanted to make sure that what we call it the CARES bill, that only the $250 billion would go to help, which we need to do, small businesses and minority-owned businesses, because these businesses were left out of the first go-round. Well, we had to say, okay, fine, we want to work with you, but we also want to include more resources for testing. We want to include more resources for unbanked businesses, which don't have access to the traditional banking system. So we had to work together to make sure that one bill that started out as a bill for only one segment of our population became broader to cover those who were unemployed, those who had no health care, those who needed testing, and the whole 9 yards. So we did see some examples there of working together, and we got that bill passed and signed into law. Personally, I've had many experiences in the past, and now actually working with Republicans. One is on HIV and AIDS. If you go back to when George Bush was in, I actually wrote what we call PEPFAR, which is the President's Emergency Response to HIV and AIDS, which has saved like 20, 30 million lives now. And I had to work then with Republicans in Congress and President George Bush to get that bill passed and signed into law. And so there are many examples in the past of how I've worked. People don't even know. They think George Bush did this. Well, he was president and he signed it, but it was my work and my organizing and my writing that bill and negotiating it that got it to the desk. So, all the time. But of course, the press generally picks up what's, the divisions and the rancor. And, that makes for interesting kind of, messaging and show drama. But really, there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes that leads to some good stuff if we only knew what that was.
And I think with that perspective, we're going to go to a quick break.
I grew up in a place where I didn't know there were more options than what existed. I'm fourth generation Mexican-American, farm labor. My parents, they spent most of their lives in the fields. And then, of course, my grandparents spent their entire lives in the fields. How does the son or daughter of a migrant farm worker really become a computer programmer? In underdog cities across the United States, you have to have a place where you can point to and say, this is where you come. That's why we started Bitwise. We teach people to code, we buy blighted properties in our downtown, rehab them, and lease them back out to the technology industry, and then we build software and software companies. Our business is 100% powered by Google products. We use analytics to understand how people are interacting with us. We've seen traffic increase by 20%. We've added 2,000 tech jobs. That's families with groceries on the table, gas in the tank, but it's also hopefulness. What Bitwise can do best is set that new expectation that you can make this happen for you and your family for generations to come.
As we come back here, I want to go a bit deep on an issue, Freada, that I know is very close to your heart, and that is, what is the role of big technology and the companies that comprise that category amidst COVID-19? What is the importance of tech accountability in this time?
Well, I certainly think the Congresswoman can talk about her efforts at the Congressional Black Caucus Tech 2020 initiative. We've been working with them for several years. I think tech accountability is more important than ever, because what we see during this pandemic is the ability to leverage technology to keep people working, to do what onwardus.org and onwardca.org have done, which is to, in a smart way and an immediate way, connect people to the emergency relief that they need, whether it's food or childcare, connect them to the kinds of upskilling and reskilling that people need to find new careers if their old careers have just been decimated. And the third that Onward is doing is to connect people to open jobs using their skills in their geography. That couldn't happen without the technology that we have now. This conversation couldn't be happening a few years ago because it relies on current technology. So we want to look at the ways in which technology is essential to bringing people together and to linking people with resources. And because of that, that requires a higher level of accountability about privacy, about security, and about access. I mentioned our SMASH scholars earlier around the country. We recently surveyed them. 41% of our low-income Black and brown girls and boys have had zero education since their schools shut down. They will never get this time back. Part of tech's accountability is to make sure everybody has broadband access, everybody has a laptop, everybody has culturally relevant curricula, everybody has access to role models who look like them, who have succeeded in the tech industry. Tech can help us achieve all of that, but tech has to share the resources. Tech has to collaborate. Tech can't parachute in and say, we're white billionaires and we know better and we can fix everything. Tech has to back up and give back to the communities that have made them billionaires.
Yeah, and a huge issue in what you've just said that I don't feel like is getting enough oxygen, particularly speaking to you all from the San Joaquin Valley in California, is that issue of broadband access. And it's not a unique issue to rural California, but it's certainly acute here. And Congresswoman Lee, I wonder from your perspective, so representing a mostly urban district, but nonetheless being deeply aware of this issue, is this a moment in which we can take a swing at universal broadband? Is this a problem that whether now or in the not so distant future we can solve?
We should be able to. And first, let me just thank Freada and Mitch for really the first two individuals that I really know personally who have captured this space to help others and to make sure that there's equal access to broadband and to technology. Because this has been saying, I lived in Alameda County right next to Silicon Valley, and for years since the 90s have tried to just break into the tech sector on behalf of my constituents and never have been able to do this. So just thank you, Mitch and Freada, for doing this and paving the way. And when we formed Tech 2020, the Congressional Black Caucus, several years ago, we wanted to do just what we're talking about today, and that is on different levels break into the tech sector as it relates to racial equity. But that included making sure that not only there was equality of opportunity with jobs, but also with the contracts, with content, with in the C-suites and with the board members of these tech companies. We made just a little bit of progress, but not enough. And so now what we see is this huge issue, the gaps now as it relates to access, where we have, as Freada said, and I've seen and met many of these wonderful young Black and brown boys in the SMASH program, and to think that their education has been interrupted based on what they have learned already, and now to stop it. I mean, these are young people who are going to be, who are leaders in many ways and who can soar if, in fact, they have access to what they have been privileged to have access to in the past through their training and through access to computers and the development of their skills to set up their own small businesses and what have you. And so in my own district in Alameda County, we have recently someone donated funds so that our young low-income students could have just computers, basically. And during this time, it's extremely important to stay connected. But for those who don't have access to their education, look at what it's going to do in terms of set them behind. And so I think equity right now across the board is what we have to fight for and what we have to ensure. Because if not, this period is going to leave more people behind. And also just when it comes to our elderly and our senior citizens who need to have access now to technology. I'm working on a project with someone in my district now for young people to begin to teach senior citizens how to use technology just so they can stay connected to their families or shop or do what they need to do. So young people who have had these opportunities and the skills can use these now to really help others survive and make it through this very horrible time.
Yes, and Rich, one of the things that I have always admired about you is you do in certain rooms describe the work that you're doing as a revolution, and I think that it is. It shouldn't be, but it is. But you're also widely respected among your peers running some of America's largest corporations. Having walked that balance and now being in this moment, what is your view on the responsibility of big business and its accountability amidst a pandemic and coming out of it?
Yeah, I think big business has responded in a way that is unprecedented, but is also responding in the same ways that they've always responded. And what we've seen is that those responses have certainly not in our communities, driven systemic, sustainable change and economic independence, nor economic inclusion, right? What it has done has band-aided a lot of the situations. And so the conversations that I'm having and the things that I'm working on and the partnerships that I'm looking to forge with them and forging with those leaders is now around, let's take these massive investments and let's make them sustainable. Let's put them into models that will actually drive inclusion in these communities. Economic inclusion. We've spent a lot of time in this country fighting for civil rights, and thank God we did. And we need to keep fighting even harder today than we ever have, because you see what just happened in Minneapolis yesterday. So we need to continue to fight there. But we now have to have a second and equally strong battle or fight and strategy, and that's around economic inclusion, around our economic rights, because it's the abuse of our economic rights that make us so vulnerable. It's why we can't afford the health services that we need. It's why we can't afford the basic data piped into our homes, right? It's why we can't afford the iPads and the computer systems. And I, am sickened to think about all of the kids that come from these communities that will have lost a year of school, right? Based on not having access, which should be a right, not having access to their curriculum, not having access to their teachers because they can't afford the data, or they can't afford the tools that allow them to connect. So those are the conversations that I want to be having and that I am having and that I will continue to drive. It's not enough to write a check and say, okay, this is going to solve that, or doing things that propel the business as it supports these communities, right? What we need to be doing are the hard things that will sustain these communities, and those things are now tied to economic rights, and that's the other battle that we must now open up in earnest, and that we must become committed to and have as much conviction to as we do around our civil rights, because the two go hand in hand. And because on the civil rights, we're not where we need to be. And on the economic rights, we're really just at the very beginning of it. And so you start to now see the true impact that this imbalance has. And that one fight does not solve for the other. They have to be in unison and they have to be strategic. And so those are the conversations that I'm now having, and that we'll be building support around.
One of those fights that all three of you have been in for decades now is for women, and a specific character that I think you have unique empathy for, Congresswoman Lee, is the single mother in this moment. I know your story is of being a single mother while going through school, and then of course your story traces all the way to this moment. How does that empathy sort of give you perspective in this moment? And even really practically, how do we support a single mother over the course of the next 12 months? Uniquely difficult situation to think about getting back to work and getting back to where they were in the economy and hopefully beyond.
Well, sure. As it was with myself, childcare is such a huge issue. And so whether it's the private sector or the public sector, we have to ensure that there's quality, affordable, accessible childcare for women, especially for single women. I know when I was raising my two children, boy, I was a student at Mills College in UC Berkeley. I was on public assistance, the whole 9 yards. I couldn't afford childcare then. They had to sit with me through classes like statistics. They know stats better than I do because they sat and I made them sit there. And that's because I couldn't afford to let them go anywhere else to childcare or couldn't find childcare that I could afford. So they went to school. And so fast forward to now, we're in the same situation. So many women, especially low income and women of color, don't have the resources to pay for childcare. So we have to figure out ways to make sure, especially during this period, that they have access to what they need in terms of childcare. Secondly, when you look at essential workers, workers on the front lines, workers who are required now to go back to work in these states that are opening up, whether it's healthy or not, whether they have the personal protective equipment, these are women in large part. Of over 50%, I think I've read somewhere with 60, 70% are women, primarily low-wage workers, primarily Black and brown women who are going to work, taking care of people, making sure that the health and economic impacts are mitigated because of their service and their jobs. Here they are now back at work in many ways in unhealthy situations. So we have to make sure that whether it's the private sector, public sector, that we at least protect them. And they deserve hazard pay. I mean, these women are out there doing these jobs under very dire circumstances. So why in the world aren't we honoring them as essential workers by making sure they have the pay that's required and the personal protective equipment that's required for them to do their job, if in fact we're going to insist that they, go to work under these circumstances. And then women, of course, still are not making, compared to men, the equitable wages. When you look at Latinas, when you look at African American women, 60 to 70% cents on the dollar, there's still a huge wage gap, which means in many respects, when these women become senior citizens, their Social Security is much lower. And so you're messing with them in their golden years by not paying them what they deserve in their younger years while they're working. And so this whole system is out of balance as it relates to gender equality. And we're seeing this now during this pandemic when women are just having a very difficult time and living on the edge. And more women are going to fall into the ranks of the poor because those support systems have not been there for them prior to the pandemic, and now certainly are very narrow and have been dwindling during this very dangerous moment.
Yeah, and Freada, I am heartened to know that the individuals on this call, whether in New York or DC or here in California, have broad influence as we think about what comes next. And you heard from the Congresswoman's remarks there, this idea of how do we rebuild more equitably? And in accomplishing that, what feels most important to you, or what small set of things feel most important to you in rebuilding for a way that doesn't leave people out just the same as we have for decades?
We have to really this time get it right. And that means everybody needs a seat at the table. If we're going to rebuild our communities, if we're going to rebuild the economy, if we're going to rebuild the healthcare system, then it has to work for everyone. And we were talking about the gender inequity here. And I think it's very important, as the Congresswoman said, we have to look, when we talk about gender, we have to take an intersectional view. That Black women, Latinx women, Native American women all earn less than white and Asian women relative to the earnings of white men. So when we're talking about gender issues, it's not monolithic. And we have to talk about the ways in which, as a white woman, I have to check my racism. I have to make sure that I am not inadvertently excluding women of color, and that the solutions that I come up with are inclusive of all women.
It's so important. And Rich, there's a lot to be concerned about in this moment, but you just so happen to be connected to a wide and growing community of people doing extraordinary things. What are you seeing in front of you specifically that gives you hope, that gets you inspired each day?
Yeah, I think one of the things, Jake, and probably the most inspiring thing that I'm seeing is we've invested in quite a number of women-owned businesses and operated businesses, in particular women of color, to be specific. And we've also done the same with men, right? And men of color. Two groups, if you will, that have historically had very, very limited access to not just capital, but equity capital in particular, and not just debt, but debt that goes alongside with equity, and the things that you can lever each of those things to do to grow a business and to sustain a business. What is inspiring me is to see how all of these companies that we have brought our PACE model to, which is purpose, access, capital, and expertise. So it's not, the issue isn't just capital. Like I said, these issues didn't start with COVID and they won't end with COVID, right? They go back, and there's a whole host of things that are a result of all of these years of abuse and neglect. And so what I'm proud of is how those companies have all fared through COVID, how prepared they were. Not that they knew that COVID was coming, and not that they were prepared for COVID, but how well they've run their businesses so that in a shock like this, they can sustain, right? And that they're in a position to sustain, and that they're making the choices and the decisions that are consistent with their purpose. And so you're seeing them not just take care of their own businesses, but in the case of like what you and Irma are doing, or in the case of what Deshaun over at Maven is doing, and I can go on and on, what Mukta and the team at Natural Club are doing, raising funds, creating products, launching platforms, you guys with the jobs platform, Deshaun and Maven with the stylist platform, funding all these stylists that have been out of work, using his business to do that, using his relationships to do that. I mean, that's how you build sustainability into a community, right? Is by putting the people in that community in a position that they can take care of their community, and that they can take care of themselves and take care of their communities, and have a conviction to that. So I'm hugely inspired by that, and that inspiration comes, over and above whatever economic return any fund could get, is to see a cohort of people hyper-focused on solving issues in their communities and having the resources to go do that, right? For me, that's the holy grail right now.
Yeah, and we're going to wrap here on this last question. But Congresswoman Lee, one of the things that I appreciate about this conversation in particular is that we've sort of zoomed in on a character, and that is a woman of color. And let's even imagine her, as is not hard to do, in your district, in the East Bay, in Oakland, here in California. And we've talked a lot at the macro about how we serve her. What do you want that individual to hear in this moment from you, somebody who's been her advocate for decades now?
We got your back. And just know that there's so many of us who see you and who hear you. And it's only by the grace of God that I'm here doing what I'm doing. And so just know that for me personally, because of my history and who I am as an African-American woman who almost, because my mother was not allowed to go into the hospital to have a C-section. She almost died in childbirth, delivering me. At the last minute, they finally let her in and delivered me using forceps. That my history and who I am is about youth. And it's about fighting for justice, and it's about fighting for equity. And it's about fighting for making sure that women who have not, again, by the grace of God, have been able to break through, I have to make sure they do break through. And that's what my life is all about.
Deeply thankful to each of our guests for making time in their busy schedules to join us here today. Thank you for joining us.
It's an honor and a privilege to be in the company of Rich and Congresswoman Barbara Lee.
This has been amazing. I can't thank you enough for putting such a dynamic group together. I've learned so much from both the Congresswoman and from Freada. And the conviction that I now leave here with is going to carry me through the next few weeks as we tackle some really difficult issues together.
Well, first of all, to Freada and to Rich, thank you all for such an inspiring morning for me here in D.C. before I get up to Capitol Hill to engage in the battles of the day. To all of you, just know that, once again, we're using technology to stay together, to learn together, to be inspired together. And I hope to be able to be with you once again. And just thank you all so much. Thank you, Freada. Thank you, Rich, for what you all do each and every day to really make this world a better place for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And thank you, Jake.
Yes. Thanks so much, guys. Thank you for joining us for this, the first episode of Onward On-Air. I want to thank especially our team at Bitwise Industries and our partners at Studio To Be for making this possible. The conversations that we had today are important, though they feel increasingly difficult in this moment. We think it critical to keep talking and want to be a place to do just that. You can continue to find us at onwardonair.com, on our YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next time.